She was 18 and a mother, cast out into the teeth of a Wyoming winter with a newborn son wrapped in the only good blanket she owned. She had no family left to her, no money and no plan. Just a small carving knife in her pocket and the fierce, quiet resolve of a person with nothing more to lose. And with that resolve, she found a collapsed creek bank and began to dig. But what nobody knew, least of all her, was that buried deep in the frozen earth was a secret left by a lonely man a generation before. A secret that would allow her not just to survive a winter that killed 40 men, but to build a life from the frozen dirt itself. This is the story of Elspeth and her son, and how they found a home in the most unforgiving of places. Elspeth was born in the autumn of 1878, the third child and only daughter of Martha and Josiah Kane. Their homestead was a hard place, carved from the unforgiving soil of the high plains, where the wind blew without cease, and the winters came down from the north like a judgment. Josiah was a man of severe and unbending faith, a man who saw God not in mercy but in hardship, and he ruled his family with the same iron will he used to break the land. Martha was his echo, a woman worn smooth by work and scripture, her kindnesses small and infrequent, like wildflowers in a rock field. Elspeth grew up in a world of straight lines and hard surfaces, the rigid rows of corn, the sharp angle of the church steeple, the unyielding wooden pew where she sat for hours on Sundays, listening to her father's lay sermons on providence and damnation. She learned early that silence was a virtue and that questions were a form of pride. She was a quiet child, observant and self-contained, with a stillness about her that was often mistaken for obedience. While her brothers were taught to work the fields, she was taught the endless, circular tasks of the house, mending, churning, baking, scrubbing. But her spirit lived elsewhere, in the vast, untamed prairie that stretched beyond their fences. It was there she met Silas Blackwood. He was an old man, a trapper and a widower, who lived alone in a small sod and timber dugout a few miles up the creek. The other homesteaders considered him half wild, a relic of an older time. But to Elspeth, he was a teacher. She would slip away from her chores, drawn to the thin curl of smoke from his chimney. He never asked why she came, and she never offered an explanation. He simply accepted her presence, as he accepted the presence of the deer that came to drink from his spring. Silas taught her a different kind of scripture, the one written in the tracks of animals, the bend of the willow, the color of the evening sky. He taught her how to read the land, to know which berries were safe and which roots held medicine. He showed her how to set a snare that was both effective and humane, how to skin a rabbit with a few deft strokes, and how to tan the hide until it was soft as velvet. He taught her the language of the knife, not as a weapon, but as a tool of creation and survival. From a block of cottonwood, he would show her how to carve the shape of a bird so precisely that it seemed it might take flight. He gave her a small knife of her own, its blade forged from an old file, its handle made of polished elk horn. "A good tool is an honest friend," he told her, his voice rough as bark. "It will never lie to you." That knife became her most treasured possession, a small, secret piece of a world that had nothing to do with her father's God. It was a connection to a man who saw not a daughter to be molded, but a person to be taught. Silas died quietly in his sleep during the winter of her 16th year, and she mourned him with a silent, aching grief that she could show to no one. The young man's name was Thomas, and he came with a survey crew mapping a new line for the railroad. He was full of easy laughter and stories of cities she could barely imagine, and for a few short months in the summer of her 17th year, he brought a startling, brilliant color to her monochrome world. He saw the girl who hid behind the quiet daughter, and he spoke to her not of duty, but of dreams. He did not see sin in her curiosity, only intelligence. He did not see willfulness in her silence, only strength. In a world that had demanded she be small and contained, he made her feel expansive. They met in secret in the cottonwood grove by the creek, the same place she had once met Silas, and there she gave him her heart. When the survey crew moved on at the end of the season, he promised he would come back for her. He never did. Perhaps he never intended to, or perhaps misfortune found him on the trail west. She never knew. What she did know, as autumn faded into the gray stillness of winter, was that she was carrying his child. She hid it for as long as she could, her body's betrayal a terrifying secret beneath the loose fabric of her winter dresses. But life cannot be hidden forever. Her son, Samuel, was born in the last week of September, a small, perfect creature whose first cries shattered the rigid silence of the Kane household forever. The judgment was as swift and cold as the first winter storm. There was no shouting, no debate. Her father, Josiah, did not see a daughter in need of comfort or a grandson in need of shelter. He saw only the stain of sin upon his house. To him, mercy was a weakness, a concession to the devil. His duty was clear, laid out in the unbending text of his faith. The day after Samuel was born, while Elspeth was still weak and bleeding, her mother came into her room. Martha did not meet her daughter's eyes. She simply placed a folded bundle of clothes on the bed, along with a loaf of bread, a small piece of salted beef, and the one thick wool blanket they owned. "Your father says you are to be gone by sunrise," she said, her voice flat and empty, the words delivered like stones. There was no cruelty in her tone, but no warmth either. It was the voice of a woman who had long ago surrendered her own heart to her husband's will. Elspeth did not plead or argue. She knew the futility of it. Arguing with her father was like reasoning with a hailstorm. She simply nodded, a deep, cold stillness settling over her. She spent the night holding her son, memorizing the shape of the room she had known her entire life, the slant of moonlight on the floorboards, the familiar scent of lye soap and dried herbs. She was not just being sent away, she was being erased. At first light, she rose and dressed herself and the baby. She wrapped Samuel tightly in the wool blanket, his small body a warm, precious weight against her own. She put the bread and beef into a canvas sack, along with the only other things that were truly hers: the horn-handled knife from Silas, and a small tin of salve she had made herself from pine pitch and herbs, another of the old trapper's lessons. She walked out of the house without looking back. Her father was waiting by the gate, his face a mask of grim righteousness. He did not speak to her. He simply pointed toward the open prairie, a gesture of final, absolute banishment. He had already packed her small trunk from the attic, containing a few more pieces of clothing and a worn Bible, and set it just outside the property line. He watched as she picked it up, her movements slow and deliberate. She settled the trunk on one shoulder, held her swaddled son in the crook of her other arm, and began to walk. She walked away from the only home she had ever known, a home that had never truly felt like hers, and headed west, toward the distant, hazy line of the mountains, with no destination in mind, only a powerful, instinctual pull away from the place of her unmaking. The wind was cold and sharp, and it carried the first hard flakes of snow. She walked for 3 days, the landscape growing wilder and more broken as she entered the foothills. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, cut by deep ravines and dotted with stands of pine and juniper. The cold was a constant physical presence, a thing that seeped into her bones. At night, she would find what shelter she could, a rocky overhang, a thicket of brush, and build a small, smoky fire. She would nurse Samuel, his small, warm mouth a fierce anchor in a world that had turned cold and vast. She ate sparingly, making the bread and beef last, and drank from the icy streams she crossed. Her world shrank to the essential: the next step, the next feeding, the next fire. The physical hardship was immense, but in a strange way, it was clarifying. Out here, there was no judgment, only the stark, honest reality of survival. The wind did not care about her sin. The snow did not care about her shame. They were simple, powerful truths, and she found she could meet them with a strength she did not know she possessed. The skills Silas had taught her, once a secret rebellion, were now the very tools of her existence. She noticed the way the pines grew thicker on the north-facing slopes, offering better shelter from the wind. She saw the tracks of a snowshoe hare and knew where to look for its burrow. These small, practical certainties were a comfort, a language she understood in a world that had ceased to make sense. On the fourth day, as a heavier snow began to fall, she stumbled upon a creek nestled in a deep, narrow valley. It was sheltered from the worst of the wind, and its banks were lined with a thick growth of cottonwoods and willows, their bare branches offering a latticework of protection. The south-facing bank was a steep wall of earth and stone, nearly 20 feet high. And there, about halfway up, she saw it. A dark hollow, a slump in the earth that suggested a partial collapse. It looked like an old animal den, or perhaps something more. Curiosity and a desperate need for real shelter drove her to investigate. She secured Samuel in a makeshift sling, scrambled up the frozen bank, and peered inside. The opening was small, but it led to a space that had clearly been dug out by human hands long ago. Most of it had caved in, filled with years of dirt and debris, but the back wall, braced by the thick roots of an ancient cottonwood tree, remained intact. It was a ruin, a forgotten hole in the earth, but to Elspeth, it was a promise. It was shelter. It was a place to stop walking. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was where they would make their stand against the winter. She had no tools but her hands and Silas's small knife, but she had a purpose. She set her son down in a sheltered nook, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and began to dig. The work was brutal. The ground was frozen solid for the first several inches, and she had to chip away at it with the point of her knife, her fingers quickly growing numb and raw. Once she broke through the frost layer, the soil beneath was softer, a mix of dirt and clay that she could scoop out with her hands. For days, she worked with a single-minded intensity, her body fueled by a dwindling supply of food and an inexhaustible well of maternal desperation. Each night, she would retreat into the shallow space she had cleared, build a small fire near the entrance for warmth, and hold Samuel close, his steady breathing a quiet rhythm against the howling of the wind. She was hollowing out a life for them, one handful of dirt at a time. The space grew slowly. First, it was just a cramped cavern, barely large enough for them to lie down in. Then, day by day, it deepened and widened, until it was a small, womb-like room, about 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep. The ceiling was low, just high enough for her to sit up straight, and the back wall was a solid mass of earth and thick, woody roots. She used her knife to smooth the walls and carve small niches into the clay for holding a candle or her tin of salve. She gathered dry grasses and pine boughs to make a thick, insulated bed on the floor. It was a burrow, a den, a primitive and elemental shelter, but it was theirs. It was the first home that had ever truly belonged to her. One afternoon, as she was deepening the back of the burrow, her makeshift shovel, a flat piece of shale, struck something hard and square. It wasn't a rock. The sound was a dull, hollow thud. Her heart quickened. She cleared the dirt away carefully, her fingers tracing the outline of a rotting wooden box, about the size of a small trunk. It was wedged deep into the earth, almost hidden behind one of the large cottonwood roots. It took her the better part of an hour to pry it loose from the grip of the earth and the roots. The wood was soft and punky with age, and the iron hinges were rusted nearly through. With a final effort, she broke the lock and lifted the lid. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside, nestled in what was once a canvas lining, was a collection of objects that seemed to glow in the dim light of her burrow. There was a heavy leather pouch, cinched tight with a drawstring. She opened it, and a stream of dull yellow gold dust and a handful of small, lumpy nuggets poured into her palm. It was more wealth than she had ever seen or imagined. Beside the pouch lay a small, oilskin-wrapped package. She unwrapped it to find a stack of old banknotes, still crisp, and a small, tarnished silver locket. Finally, at the bottom of the box was a letter, a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with wax. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and careful, the ink faded but still legible. It was dated August 1852. "To whoever finds this," it began. "My name is Elias Vance. I built this place to wait for my wife, Anna, and our son, Jacob, who were to follow me from Ohio. I came west to find gold and make a place for them. I found some, as you can see, enough for a small farm and a good life. I have been waiting here for 2 years. A month ago, a letter finally reached me. They died of river fever on the Platte. There is nothing left for me back east, and nothing for me here either. I am old now, and my lungs are failing. I do not think I will survive another winter in this place. I leave what I have here. It was meant for my family. If you have found this shelter, perhaps you are in need of it as I once was. Use it to build a life. Do not let it be for nothing. The locket holds a sketch of my Anna. She was a good woman." Elspeth sank back on her heels, the letter shaking in her hand. The silence of the burrow was profound. She felt the presence of this man, this stranger from another time, his grief and his hope echoing in the small, dark space. He had built this shelter for a family that never came, and now, a generation later, another family had found it. She slowly opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, exquisitely detailed pencil drawing of a young woman with a kind, gentle face. A tear, hot and unexpected, fell from Elspeth's eye and landed on the faded paper. It was not a tear of sadness for herself, but of a deep, resonant sorrow for Elias Vance, and a powerful, overwhelming wave of gratitude. He had left behind more than gold. He had left behind a blessing. His loss had become her improbable salvation. The discovery of the cash changed everything. It was not just the material wealth, but the sudden, powerful infusion of hope. She was no longer just a survivor, clinging to the edge of existence. She was a builder, with the means to create a proper home. The first priority was to get real supplies. The nearest place of trade, according to the maps Thomas had once shown her, was a trading post called 3 Creeks, a hard 2-day walk to the south. Leaving Samuel alone for that long was unthinkable. She waited for a break in the weather, for one of the rare, clear winter days when the sun was bright and the wind was still. She bundled Samuel so thoroughly in the wool blanket and furs that only the tip of his nose was visible. and securing him tightly to her chest, she set out. The journey was arduous. The snow was deep in places, and the cold was relentless. But the gold dust in her pouch was a tangible weight of purpose, and it drove her forward. 3 Creeks was little more than a single long log building and a few outbuildings, its chimney puffing a welcome plume of smoke into the vast white landscape. The proprietor was a man named Jedediah Croft, a barrel-chested man with a thick gray beard and shrewd, watchful eyes. He looked at her and the bundle on her chest with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A lone woman with a baby in the middle of winter was an anomaly, and anomalies were often trouble. Elspeth said nothing of her circumstances. She simply unwrapped a small portion of her gold dust onto his counter. "I need to trade," she said, her voice steady. Croft examined the dust, weighing it on a small brass scale. He grunted, his expression unreadable. "What do you need?" She had made a careful list in her head. She needed tools, first and foremost. A good axe, a small shovel, a hammer, and nails. She needed a small cast-iron stove, the kind used in line shacks and shepherd's wagons, and she needed food that would last. Flour, salt, coffee, beans, and a side of salt pork. Croft listened to her list, his eyes moving from her face to the gold dust and back again. He was a fair man, if not a friendly one, and the weight of her gold was honest. He began to gather the items, his movements efficient and practiced. He found her a used but sturdy stove, its iron belly promising a world of warmth. He sold her a sharp, well-balanced axe head, which she would have to haft herself. The load was heavy, far too much to carry in one trip. She arranged to leave the stove and the bulk of the supplies, taking only what she could manage on a makeshift sledge she built from branches and hide. As she left, Croft spoke to her for the first time with something other than business. "That's a hard trail in this weather," he said, nodding toward the north. "Watch for drifts." It was not kindness, precisely, but it was an acknowledgement of her struggle, and for that, she was grateful. The journey back was a triumph. The weight of the axe head and the flour on her sledge was the most beautiful burden she had ever carried. Back in her burrow, she set to work with renewed energy. She found a straight, strong length of ash, and using Silas's knife and a heated rock, painstakingly carved and fitted a handle for the axe. The feel of the completed tool in her hands was a revelation. With it, she could fell small trees, chop firewood, and begin to properly shore up her home. She cut timbers to brace the entrance of the burrow, creating a short, sturdy tunnel that would keep the snow from drifting in. She built a rough but functional door from split logs, chinked with clay and moss. The second trip to 3 Creeks to retrieve the stove was even more difficult, but the thought of its warmth was a powerful motivator. Dragging the heavy iron stove on her sledge through the snow was the hardest physical task of her life. But when she finally got it back and settled it into its place in the corner of her burrow, the feeling of accomplishment was profound. She had no proper stovepipe, so her first task was to find a way to vent the smoke. She carefully dug a narrow chimney flue up through the dirt ceiling, lining it with flat stones mortared together with wet clay. It was a smoky, imperfect solution, but it worked. That night, for the first time, she lit a fire in the stove. The small iron box began to radiate a deep, steady heat that filled the entire space. The damp chill that had lived in her bones for months began to recede. She sat on her pine bough bed, nursing Samuel in the warm, flickering light, and felt a sense of security so complete it was almost overwhelming. She was warm, she was fed, and she was safe. Her burrow was becoming a home. Her smoke did not go unnoticed. In a landscape so vast and empty, a thin column of wood smoke was a signal, a sign of human life. A week after she installed the stove, she was outside splitting wood when she saw a figure on horseback approaching from the east. Her first instinct was fear, a tightening in her gut. But the rider was a woman, and she rode not with haste, but with a slow, deliberate pace. The woman dismounted a short distance from the burrow and walked toward her, carrying a covered basket. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with a face mapped by sun and hardship, but her eyes were kind. "I'm Mary O'Connell," she said, her voice gentle. "My homestead is over the next ridge. I saw your smoke and thought you might be in need of company." Elspeth, who had not had a real conversation with another person in months, could only nod, her throat tight. Mary looked at the burrow's entrance, at the neat stack of firewood, at the small, determined woman with an axe in her hand, and her expression softened with understanding. She did not ask questions. She simply lifted the cloth from her basket. "I brought some stew," she said, "and a bit of fresh milk, if your little one is old enough." That simple act of kindness, the offering of a warm meal without condition or question, broke through the wall Elspeth had built around herself. She invited Mary inside, and the older woman marveled at the cozy, well-ordered space she had carved from the earth. They sat by the stove, and while Samuel slept, Elspeth found herself telling her story, the words pouring out in a quiet, steady stream. Mary listened patiently, her presence a comforting warmth in the small room. From that day on, Mary became a regular visitor, a lifeline to the human world. She would bring supplies, news, and the simple gift of her time. She taught Elspeth how to make a proper sourdough starter and how to mend clothes with stitches that were nearly invisible. In return, Elspeth shared her firewood and offered her skills in tanning the hides of the rabbits she snared. A quiet friendship formed, built not on shared sentiment, but on a foundation of mutual respect and practical support. Through Mary, Elspeth learned she needed a proper stovepipe and door hinges if she was to be truly secure. Mary told her of Abner Finch, the blacksmith at 3 Creeks, a man known for his skill and his taciturn nature. On her next trip for supplies, Elspeth sought him out. Abner was a tall, lean man with soot permanently etched into the lines of his hands. He listened to her request for a stovepipe and hinges, his gaze direct and serious. He asked for the precise measurements, which she provided, scratched onto a piece of bark. He nodded. "Come back in 2 days." When she returned, he had forged a perfect set of hinges and a sturdy, well-seamed pipe, the craftsmanship evident in every detail. He charged her a fair price in gold dust, and as she left, he added, "A good door keeps the winter out, but a good neighbor lets the spring in." It was the most he had ever said at one time, and the words stayed with her. A piece of simple, hard-won wisdom. Winter tightened its grip on the high country. The snows fell deeper, and the temperatures plummeted, staying below freezing for weeks on end. News, brought by Mary or the occasional trapper passing through 3 Creeks, told of a brutal season. Cattle were freezing to death in the fields, and more than one homesteader had been caught in a blizzard and lost. 40 men, it was said, had died across the territory from exposure, starvation, or accidents in the deep snow. But in her burrow, Elspeth and her son were safe. The little stove kept the small space warm and dry. Her larder was stocked with flour, beans, and salted meat. She had a good supply of firewood stacked just outside her door. The rhythms of their life were simple and quiet. She would wake before dawn, stoke the fire, and make coffee. She would nurse Samuel, his growing body a constant, wondrous affirmation of life. During the day, she worked. She checked her snare lines, skinned and prepared the rabbits she caught, and scraped and tanned their hides. She improved the burrow, adding a small carved wooden shelf and smoothing the walls with a final layer of clay. In the long, dark evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp, she would take out Silas's knife and a piece of cottonwood and carve. She carved small, intricate figures of birds and animals, her hands remembering the lessons of the old trapper. The focused, repetitive work was a kind of meditation, a way of ordering the world into a shape she could understand. She was no longer just the cast-out daughter of Josiah Cain. She was a woman who could read the weather in the sky, who could build a door and set a snare, who could turn a piece of wood into a living thing. She was the mother of Samuel, a healthy, thriving boy who was beginning to smile and coo in his sleep. She became a known, if enigmatic, part of the small, scattered community. Jedediah at the trading post called her the Creek Woman and began setting aside small things he thought she might need. Abner the blacksmith fashioned her a small, sharp blade for her fine carving work, asking for nothing in return. Mary O'Connell became like an aunt to Samuel, her visits a source of joy and comfort. They did not pry into her past. They simply accepted her as she was, a quiet, capable woman who had made a home in an impossible place. Her life was not easy, but it was her own. It was a life built not on the rigid doctrines of her father, but on the practical, honest truths of the earth and the quiet, steady kindness of strangers. The burrow was more than a shelter. It was a testament. It was proof that a life could be built from what others had abandoned, that a home could be found in the wreckage of a loss. As the days began to lengthen and the iron-hard grip of winter started to soften, Elspeth would sometimes sit at the entrance of her burrow in the late afternoon, watching the light change on the snow-covered hills. The world was still white and frozen, but there was a new promise in the air, a subtle shift in the angle of the sun. Samuel would be sleeping soundly inside, wrapped in a soft, rabbit fur blanket she had made for him. In these quiet moments, her thoughts would often drift. She would think of her family, of the cold, hard house she had left behind. There was a dull ache there, a sadness for the love she had never been given. But it was no longer a sharp, open wound. It was a scar, a part of her history, but it did not define her present. She would take out the two objects she kept in a small wooden box she had carved. One was the horn-handled knife from Silas Blackwood, its blade worn smooth with use, its handle gleaming with the patina of her own hand. The other was the small silver locket from Elias Vance, the kind face of his lost Anna still visible within. She would hold one in each hand, feeling their weight and their history. Silas, the man who had taught her how to survive, who had given her the skills to be self-reliant. Elias, the man who had provided her with the means, whose long-ago grief had become her foundation. They were two strangers, two lonely men who had shown her more care and provided more for her future than her own father ever had. They were her true ancestors, her spiritual kin. Their legacy was not one of blood or name, but of practical grace. One had given her knowledge, the other a home. In this small burrow, dug into the side of a frozen creek, the lives of these three solitary people, Elspeth, Silas, and Elias, had converged across time to create a place of safety and warmth for a small, innocent child. She looked at her hands, no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a girl, but the strong, calloused hands of a woman who knew how to work, how to build, how to endure. She had not merely survived the winter, she had prevailed. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into the best thing she had ever had. A life of her own making, a home filled with peace, and a future for her son. Elspeth was 18 and a mother. She had been cast out with nothing, and she had built a home from the frozen earth. It was the best life she had ever known. This story reminds us that home is not always a place we are given, but often a place we must build for ourselves, sometimes from the most unexpected materials. If you were moved by Elspeth's journey, please consider sharing her story with someone who might find strength in it. And now, a question for you to reflect on. What have you built from something that was broken or left behind in your own life?